In the last few years, this topic has emerged as one of our key areas we need to focus on in extension volunteer systems across the board. The wonderful thing about extension is that we have amazing resources within our midst who can help us really gain knowledge in these areas. I would like to introduce our moderator, who is Dr. Nia Imani Fields. She is the Maryland 4-H Program Leader and Assistant Director of Maryland Extension. Dr. Fields has a doctorate in Urban Affairs and Public Policy from Morgan State University and has a long career in youth and community engagement. As the Maryland 4-H Program Leader, Dr. Fields provides leadership and direction for 4-H youth development programs, faculty, and staff. Her true purpose in life is to expose as many young people as possible to new and exciting experiences that encourage youth to dream big. So welcome and thank you for being our moderator.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good, what time is it? Morning, right? Good morning, everyone. I barely made it here, so it's meant to be that I'm here. We all have disaster flight stories these days, but I had to run to my connection flight, and they were closing the door as I made it to the plane. So I'm supposed to be here in this moment, and I'm glad to be here with you all this morning. So today we're talking about recruiting a diverse volunteer base, and this is a critical topic of us all because we've nationally made a commitment that our youth in our 4-H community will reflect the diversity, the depth, and the breadth of our American diversity and culture. And we have a ways to go. We've been doing a lot of great work in this space. I'd say that we've invested a lot of our time in cultivating diverse youth, but we have a lot of work to do in cultivating diverse and representative volunteers and team members on our faculty and staff. So we'll be talking a little bit about that today. In order for us to do this work, I wrote down a few things that I think are important, and then I'll ask our panelists to introduce themselves and speak to the critical topic that we're discussing today. This work will require us to be bold, right? It's going to require some disruption. We don't like to disrupt things in most spaces because it's uncomfortable. It requires us to deal with folks who may not be happy about the disruption. And because we are a legacy organization, we have strong roots and histories that many folks don't like to see change. But if we want to get to this goal, it will require us to be bold and require some disruption to challenge the status quo. And I've heard this term being used here as well, but Pittman talks about this notion of robust equity. And that really is intentional countering of inequality, institutionalized privilege, and systemic deficits, and the intentional promotion of thriving for those who've experienced inequality. So a few words that stick out to me there: intentional. We have to be intentional. We have to counter something. It's not enough for us to have words that say our programs are open to all without the actions that back it, right? So we're going to be talking a little bit about that today. Having the countering of inequality and the intentional promotion of thriving. So I'm going to allow our panelists here to introduce themselves. We'll allow questions at the mic, and we have some that have come up ahead of time that we'll go through, and we'll have this be an organic conversation where we really learn from one another. Sound good? All right, I'm gonna pass it on to our dear friend, my predecessor here in Maryland 4-H, Dr. Jeff Howard, to introduce himself and share a few words about the importance of this topic.
I have my own mic, how about that? I'm fixing to grab that microphone from her. So, is that on? Oh, okay. There we go. How's that? We hearing okay? All right, super. It's really wonderful to be here. I know the past couple of years not being able to gather in person and so forth, these opportunities are extra special now. So I had the good fortune of presenting at the last, well, I think it was the last, in Montana, if that was the last face-to-face. So met so many people there, and so it's so wonderful to reconnect with the number. It's been like old home week up here at the podium the last 30 minutes, reconnecting with folks and so forth. So as was mentioned, I'm Jeff Howard. I bring a number of things to the table today I wanted to share with you. One is I've been with Extension for 33 years. I was a county extension agent, I was a district specialist, I was a state specialist. All of this was in Texas. And then I had the good fortune of being recruited to serve as the state 4-H program leader in Maryland. for a little over 10 years, and then I transitioned into starting a new unit for program and organizational development that we wanted to start, and so I'm one of the assistant directors on the senior administrative team. And with that said, we're really putting intentional emphasis on building our program development process, and within that is a concentration on diversity, equity, inclusion, and we add respect, DEIR. One of the biggest claims to fame, though, that I have was I was a 4-H volunteer. I was a club manager, we called them, or club leader. With a little bit of humor, I'll tell you, when I was a 4-H specialist, I served on the team that wrote the club manager guide, and then I was a club manager. I didn't know what I was talking about before. Everything was academic, and it was a very difficult job, so I bring that kind of experience too. I'll wrap up with saying, why is this critical? A few things. One is, our programs and our volunteers need to reflect the people that we're hopeful will come to them. So that's why it's critical. I'll also interject that sometimes we often think there may be resistance from stakeholders when we think about diversity and inclusion, and similarly with volunteers, but we have to ask ourselves some tough questions. Part of our hard reality is that resistance comes from within also, and people that work for us, and that complex resistance that comes forward. So we have to be intentional to build a concentration on that, so it's critical. Thanks.
It's a little intimidating, this big thing. Poso Mawani Wiak, Amani Jones, Aneka Swisian, Nato Matnamane Natawam, O Matnamane Wakenessam Manowich. Let's see, I said, hello, everyone. My name is Annie Jones, and I am Menominee from the Menominee tribe in Wisconsin. And I speak Menominee just a little tiny little bit. I'm just learning. And I'm really happy to be with all of you today. I am a professor, organization development, and tribal nation specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension, also affiliate faculty with community and environmental sociology and American Indian Studies. And as part of my work, I get to work with two fabulous, a WISE council and a tribal advisory council. And I've learned a lot about starting where people are in that kind of work. And let's see, I think this work is important because I live by the 4 values of Indigenous research, and that is respect, already mentioned, and relevance, relationships, and reciprocity. And reciprocity to me means a lot, that if we are to expect to have support, a welcome set of volunteers and people that we work with, we need to reciprocate. We need to be relevant to their needs. We need to respect all of our audiences, and we need to take the time to spend time with them, in relationship, to be with them, to care about what they need, to say yes when we're invited to something, and realize that people are inviting us because they really want to spend time with us. And so I think that those are the core principles that I try to work with.
Good morning. I'm Maurice Smith, the National Program Leader with the National Institute of Food and Agriculture and the Division of Youth and 4-H. Former experience, I served 3 years at Virginia State University, which is one of our 1890. I have worked, I would say I've been in extension for a little over 12 or 13 years, in and out between 1862 and 1890 as it deals with 4-H youth development. I also served as a 4-H agent, 4-H extension specialist, and a 4-H volunteer in college. So I served early tasks and had on the grassroots that had experience. This is a critical topic. This is no easy. It's no easy fit. It's no easy way. But to me, I look at the concept of listening to learn and understand. I don't know if some of you all are familiar with the CTRU work, Coming Together for Racial Understanding. One of the most important, and this is just a soft skill, listening to learn and understand could go a long ways to coming up with solutions on this very topic. So I'm just going to leave it there. I want to over talk my time, but thank you.
Thank you, Maurice. Well, good morning. My name is Xiomara Diaz Vargas. I currently work for Purdue Extension as a state specialist for new audience initiatives, but that's just my new assignment. Before of that, I had been serving in Extension for 18 years as a county educator. But before of that, I'm a second generation of Extension professional, and I was a 4-H'er. And I started my career in Extension in Puerto Rico. My degree is from the College of Ag in Animal Science and Marketing and Economics. And I started my journey in Extension as a professional there, as a A&R educator. I had the privilege to invest and also grow my skills with the University of Florida, UF-IFAS, as an extension agent in Marion County, Ocala, Florida. And that was an eye-opening to be exposed to the different challenges that we face, because depending on the area that you serve, regardless, we are representing the same system and the same organization. Things look kind of similar. It's not the same. We are working with a different culture and a different community, and we have to be mindful on that. My journey continued in Extension, where I had the opportunity and the privilege to work with Texas A&M as an Ag 4-H educator. And after that, ended in Indianapolis, Indiana, which means that I have a little bit of rural, a little bit of urban, plus like across extension programs, because the way of surviving in extension is to collaborate and understanding our resources, identifying the needs that make us relevant, like, and also aligning those opportunities that we already have in that amazing menu that extension offer, how that can connect with those needs that we can find out there. We just have to be sensitive. In terms of like, and then after working in Indianapolis, Marion County, Indiana, I had the opportunity to serve as a state specialist. That's my position right now, where I support my colleagues and also work with like finding opportunities on creating a new cadre of volunteers that can help us like do the work that we need to do in a demanding society. Recruiting, supporting, and relating a diverse base of volunteers is critical in the present and the future of extension. We all know that. If we are not intentional on working on a new generation of volunteers, this will affect the relevance, the expansion, and the growth of extension in our communities, and that will be reflected nationwide. Also, the rapidly changing world and different demographics cannot be sustained with a one-size-fits-all volunteer management practice. In most cases, these system that we had promoted does not respond to the cultural nuances of our cultures. And in my case, what I keep like telling our educators and the messaging I want you to take today is that we have to continue being sensitive and listening and sensing what's happening with the people we serve and the people we want to serve as well.
Great, wonderful. Let's give it up for our panelists. We are excited to hear from more today. I'm excited. So we're going to start with a question that came ahead of time, and we all hopefully know, or will learn soon, that there's a difference between diversity and inclusion, right? So diversity is who's in the space. Inclusion is how do they feel valued, respected, and engaged in the program, in the process, in the conversation. We sometimes get one step done and don't get to the next step of inclusion and hearing all voices and providing the space for all voices to be valued. So my first question is for Maurice, and I'd love to hear from Xiomara as well. What does inclusion look like in extension as it relates to volunteers?
Thank you. To address that, I have a few points. One point is having all backgrounds, expertise, in looking at 4-H and adult and youth at the planning of such educational programs to better understand the needs of the community. But I also add, when you're planning programs, you're planning on the needs of the community. But where do we often add the interest of the child? We should include both, in having the inclusion, that input of youth in program planning could be essential. Also, program impacts are reflected of an array of backgrounds. Volunteers have a seat, voice, and a sense of being heard when seated at the table. Diversified volunteer base that is reflective of the community that we work in, valuing a volunteer voice while maintaining extension policies. One thing that I want to expand on when we talk about inclusion, are we including everyone at the table? When you look at your demographics in your state, county, locally, or regionally, do our volunteers that have been included in our extension system reflect our youth that we serve, or reflect the adults that we serve? So expanding opportunities for recruitment to include diverse civic organizations, service organizations, sports clubs, community events, historically minority or gender-based colleges and universities, minority fraternity and sorority organizations, professional organizations, advocacy groups, and even natural resources partners. So again, we have a job to do to be more inclusive.
Okay, and I just want to acknowledge that this is not a situation only for 4-H. I want to acknowledge that in this room we have extension professionals in all the areas. Volunteer inclusion in extension promote growth, presence, and endless cross-learning, especially with the rapidly changed world and different demographics. And when I talk about the cross-learning, is that how we will learn if we don't promote what we preach in terms of hands-on. Sometimes we have our educational resources that give us best practices and give us some cue points in terms of what we should be doing. But believe me, even I bring my multicultural experience, because it's just how evolved in my life. Those bullet points can just help you, guide you, but you have to be intentional, and also put it in practice. And when I said put it in practice, is doing finding opportunities that can help you identify what the reality is, because things keep changing. Not only for the, and this is something that in terms of fostering a sense of belonging for everyone, that's something that is very important in terms of inclusive, being the inclusion in extension, because that's what we want people. That's the reason why we have so many volunteers, dedicated volunteers right now, the loyal ones, is because they found that sense of belonging. How we can pass that to a new generation of volunteers, making sure that we connect with that. Someone did that work. That's the reason why we have them present in our programs. As I said, not only for the fantastic volunteers that are already supporting our program, but also for all of those volunteers we need and have not been represented or underutilized in our organization. And most of these go back to what Maurice shared with us. It's just helping people find their areas in our organization, but also listening to what they want to do and what they can bring to the table. As extension professionals, it is essential to recognize the actual value in all people, not just a few that we think make our lives easier because they know what they're doing. We have to invest. It's like when we raise kids, it's when we just grow a new crop. You have a process of evolution. And then if you are working with the crop and you want to make a good salad, just put them all together and your salad will just have a lot of flavor and a lot of nutrients. Which means that it's just finding those ways to connect and be having if you want to take it that way, just have a business mindset. what do you want to do, or what do you need to do to go to plan or to point A to point B and also have a good result? And we have to be strategic on that. In this case, we value, as I said, we value all people, no matter their beliefs, ethnic backgrounds, talents, age, gender, and other unique traits, because people often feel more welcome at an organization when they also find people that look like them or that think like them. That's the reason why we are here in this room. We all believe in extension, mission, and vision. And that just, even we don't know each other by name, like all of us, that make us like find like a connectivity, which means that that's the same mindset that we have to continue having in terms of like volunteer inclusion in extension.
Thank you so much, Maurice and Xiomara. A few words that came and resonated with me, and I want to ask the question to a group, is how many of you feel uncomfortable when you walk into a space and you see no one that looks like you or you feel comes from your background or connects? How many of you feel uncomfortable? I do. I do, most of us, right? So it's not easy to go into a space that is new for us, right? It's going to require us to be uncomfortable, some disruption to our normal status quo and how we do our business, but imagine a child or a constituent that comes to our program and we ask them to do the same, right? We ask them to come to our program and blend in, and there's no one else that looks like them or speaks their language or comes from their background or is interested in what they want to learn about. So if we're asking that of our folks, our youth and our adults that we serve, then we should be able to do that ourselves, right? And step into new environments. Maurice and Xiomara both shared some examples of spaces where we may not be cultivating potential volunteers, and thinking about whose voices are not at the table, which communities have I not tapped into, which organizations have I not tried to build relationship with, and then that relationship is going to take time to build. We had 100 years in the making of some of these relationships we have now, so it will take some time for us to cultivate those new ones. So thank you, Xiomara and Maurice. Annie, the next question is for you, and it's around volunteer. How should volunteer recruitment strategies change? Audiences, can you hear me? Is this working? Okay. Audiences in communities, or should they? Should they look different?
I guess my quick answer to that is no and yes. So I've been with Extension for 24 years, and before that I was a high school teacher. And I think one of the most important lessons that I learned as a high school teacher is one that you've probably all learned, and that is to give over control and to make it an experience that is beneficial for them and not for me. Not the easiest thing for me to give over control in a classroom situation. Now I do all kinds of planning. I do strategic planning, action planning, scenario planning, everything with the name planning in it. And so I carried that lesson that I learned from being a high school teacher and letting them kind of control their own journey with me to some of those planning experiences. So I started as a county educator in Kenosha County, what at the time I like to call the epicenter of 3 million people between Chicago and Milwaukee. I think it's quite a lot more than that now. And at that time I was working with the United Way. And in Wisconsin is one of the, Annie Casey calls it like the worst place to be African American in the country. We're a very white-centric kind of culture. And so African American infant mortality was not just bad in Wisconsin, but Kenosha County was one of the worst places for African American infant mortality. So the United Way asked me to lead a planning effort that would look at strategies for reducing African American infant mortality. And so I, walked in with my briefcase, and all of the bright people were around the table, and what we thought were the right people around the table, because I only knew like the names and the titles, and there were people from the health department, from the medical profession, all of the right agencies were there. But at the first meeting, I looked around the table and there wasn't a single African American around that table. And so I just said, wow, in a friendly kind of way. And I was like, I wonder how this conversation would be different if we had African American professionals and moms around the table. And so that opened up a whole new way of thinking about planning. And so the group quickly identified some professionals. The professionals then identified some moms who would work with us. And that completely changed, I think, the outcomes of that entire experience. Not only did they give us really important information and input, but then it really energized them to come up with strategies for developing PSAs, to star in those PSAs, to run cable television programs, to have spots on radio stations that were meaningful to them. And they ran that. They had control of that. We were just kind of there in the background to make their dreams and wishes come true. And it did have an impact. We're still working on that all these years later, but that was a lesson to me that I continue to carry into my work. Give over control, make sure that the right people are at the table, include the voices that may otherwise be left out of the conversation. Imagine how different that outcome would be had that group of medical professionals come up with some PSAs. It wouldn't have been meaningful at all. So I think that another important lesson that I have carried with me as a credo in my work is the quote, "People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care." And it's not, as we've all said already, it is not enough to just put that in a mission statement or in a value statement or to communicate that in our publications and materials. It's important to do that, but it's really important to live that value. There is a difference between espoused values and the values that we actually live by. And people smell that, they know that. We have to be authentic in our desire to build relationships.
Great, thank you so much, Annie. So in extension work, we have a lot of planning, and you mentioned a little bit about that earlier. We do program plans, we plan for the year, and we think about ways that we're going to recruit volunteers, how we will retain them, and provide professional development opportunities. So for Jeff, my question is, how can we incorporate inclusive volunteer recruitment and retention practices in our actual extension program plans? And is that a critical piece of the program planning process?
It surely is. How about that? So we have a chance to chat about that a little bit. One of the things I failed to do, though, I'm going to digress just a little bit, but I am starting my clock, Dr. Fields, because she, other than kicking me to let me know, I'm known to be long-winded, but a piece I didn't mention that I wanted to speak to earlier was I'm bringing to the table a perspective and view of the LGBTQ+ community. So I happen to be part of that community. I lived most of my life closeted, and most of my career closeted, and came out first to family about 13 years ago, and then gradually came out professionally and so forth, and now I'm all out there. And I can tell you one of the nice things about that is the number of extension professionals, volunteers, and children, oh my gosh, that come up to me and say, just by living your life as you've lived it and openly, and my partners at things and so forth, my kids are with me, they're adult age, but anyway, they rally behind me when I write papers about this topic and on Facebook and so forth. There's a subtlety to that they're accepted, that they can belong. I can be there too, all of those things. And so I'm pleased to bring that to the table. The other thing, though, that I bring to the table is the term is living stealth. It's where you're part of that community, but you live as if you're not. And because I was living stealth, I heard some pretty hateful, nasty things. I've certainly heard hateful, nasty things even after coming out, things said to me. But before that, especially within Extension family, jokes, comments, things that were said about other workers and so forth that were more effeminate or perhaps, they theorized were part of that community and so forth. So earlier when I said we have work to do within ourselves, that's certainly true. And so I bring all of that to the table and the passion that I have for we can do better than this. Speaking of that, we have to be intentional about programming. So from the program development perspective, now this is broad spectrum. The reality is that when many folks within Extension think about diversity and inclusion, our minds go to what I call internal compliance review, our civil rights approach. And we have to own that. I mean, that's often a focus that we've had over the last 30, 40 years within cooperative extension. And there's so much time that's spent on that. The intent was of pure intent, without question. The idea of being intentional about including folks all across communities within our extension programs. I have observed, though, that often that's our default. That's what we think about. And we can say, oh, sure, my programs are diverse. I met parity. And, I checked that box. And we have to think deeper than that. So related to program planning, some of the notes that I jotted down is, as it relates to this, you have to think about it in the context of, if you're in an extension program where you write annual extension program plans, or maybe you write a 5-year plan, however it happens to be, whatever that happens to look like, do you spend and invest time thinking about how will I intentionally work in a capacity where we're able to recruit volunteers in, recruit constituents in to our extension programs? What will I intentionally do? And so you almost have to take a bit of an assessment of not just yourself, but your program. Literally, I call it community asset mapping. Map it all out. Where am I at? What do I have? All of those things to kind of get a perspective, a visual that was, I appreciate Maurice earlier saying image graphics, if I had that right, I think there was a phrase that was used. But as you look at the image of that, where do I need to work? Where do I need to reach out? So that's not new information. My gosh, that's been part of the extension program development process for years, hasn't it? Where we would review our county or our state or whatever it happened to be and kind of look toward things. But as we look at our community, however that happens to look where you work, and seeing where there are voids, then making the time to plan intentionally about what will I do to bring folks into my extension programs. So that may take some work on our part. We may have to become more culturally competent about the community that's missing from our work, and that takes invested time and energy to learn about that. And further, some of the community's culture, the culture of the community is so significant that you have to learn, how do I get my foot in the door, for lack of a better term. But as you do annual program plans, you need to think through all of that and map that out. We do it by quarter. We call them outputs. What are we doing this quarter? And so you literally build that in where it causes you to concentrate on that. So that's a little bit of a pragmatic type of a thing, but it's an approach that we can begin to follow, where then we begin to grow ourselves and our programs and so forth. So lastly, as I wrap up, I'll just say that I'm looking at my cheat sheet right here. If you don't have that in your program plans, if there's not a box or there's not something to cause that focus, then bring that forward. That's something, we did that, I'm doing, because Nia and I both work in Maryland, we've incorporated that as part of our annual program planning process, our diversity, equity, inclusion, and respect approach. And as such, we're causing ourselves to focus on that on a very purposeful and intentional approach. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. And you made some reference to a few things that I want to expound upon just briefly. Cultural competence. And in order for us to increase our cultural competence, we have to invest in learning cultures other than our own, right? We encourage that for us in the 4-H world of our youth. And if we're teaching a specific DEI type of course, but it should be something naturally that is a part of our professionalism, is learning cultures beyond your own. Figuring out what cultures exist in your county, your city, your region, and your state, and taking some time to explore through museums, engaging in public discourse, eating different meals. I mean, all of these types of things are ways that we can expand our own awareness of different cultures. And finding cultural guides that can help introduce you to different communities that you may not have entered before, that are respected or who are respected and can kind of engage and introduce you to new partners is another strategy. One resource or an example of what Jeff shared, in addition to including for those of us who are administrators in the room or have some advocacy with administrators, is to formalize this in your program plans. What are the things you need to learn about your community? What are the barriers that exist to diversifying your volunteer base? and what are the strategies you're going to use to overcome those barriers. And one tool that we've developed a few years ago is in e-extension. It's a free module. We have 3 modules on cultural competency. One is on understanding the terms related to DEI. One is on self-reflection and where you fit in this realm of conversation. And the third is dedicated just to volunteers. It's a free module. A few states have already embedded it inside of their volunteer required training, and CMR might talk a little bit more about that in just a little bit. But there are tons of resources that exist within our extension family already, and it's a matter of us institutionalizing these resources and practices if we're looking to make that disruption or having that bold change within our systems. So speaking of which, I'm going to ask the next question to Maurice. What do you see as the biggest diversity and inclusion challenge? And if you have any tidbits on how we might become or be able to overcome some of those barriers, that would be great. What's the biggest challenge you think we're facing?
Thank you. I'm going to speak on some of my notes. Volunteers not reflective of the demographics served, and I put a hashtag, representation does matter. Not just including people to volunteer, but ensure they feel a sense of belonging. Retaining and recruiting possible burnout, or even combating discrimination in the everyday work as a volunteer. Possible barriers to new volunteers on past experiences as an adult that could prevent them to serve as a change agent. And I put, for an example, a barber, leaders in the community, coaches. Volunteer privilege as it relates to personal agendas. Lack of respect for extension leadership, thus creating silos of sabotage. Ineffective communication. And I want to point on this question. Do we as a system meet our volunteers where they are located and when they can volunteer? Community, morning, afternoon, early morning, Saturdays. Getting the message out that we are inclusive and open to all. I'm gonna repeat that. Getting the message out that we are inclusive and open to all. Too often, communities of color and lower economic families and communities don't know about extension or the services or opportunities. The past look of extension reflects a rural white community, and that barrier and stigma is still creating walls for underserved audiences, preventing them from coming forward. And I also see that minority volunteers don't want to be the first or only ones to break the line and add that needed diversity. Helping them to understand that they are the ones who will help encourage more youth, families, and volunteers of color. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maurice. Such great words of wisdom there. Now, I want to send a reminder out that we do have 2 mics open. If you have some live questions, we'll be happy to offer those for our panelists as well. Lots of great things there as far as seeing who's at the table, who's not there, and once they're there, how is their voice valued, right? So we're continuing to remind ourselves about that. And then questioning our own intentions within our organization is a critical point to continue to reflect on. And Jeff is about to expand on this with this next question that I asked. But authentic DEI work takes time, right? It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't come without disruption, particularly within a legacy organization like Extension. So how do we address conflicts of opinion, traditions, things that we can see and things that we can't see within our own organizational culture, and policy surrounding diversity and inclusion, particularly as it relates to our volunteer system, without fear of retribution as an employee?
Well, that's a whole lot to unpack, isn't it? My goodness. So I appreciated Maurice's comments about, I was also reflecting back to the program planning idea and the thought as you think on an annual basis of program planning and how will I be intentional about imagery and, rainbow pride stickers up at the, entrance of the 4-H office or the extension office and including imagery, individuals of color in our promotional materials and all of the, and then diversity of programming also. People often, they think back to some historic base and can we subtly introduce the more contemporary programs that we have just from imagery and so forth. So I love the intentionality of thinking through that and that subtlety that happens as people begin to realize, oh, I can go to that. So, or I can be involved. You know, I see people like myself. With that noted, as we begin to plan to do that, as we begin to put subtle imagery out there as well as intentional programs, sometimes that's met with resistance. Sometimes that resistance isn't just stakeholders or volunteers that we work with, but it's also funders, county judges, especially out in our more rural communities and so forth. Sometimes, regretfully, it's individuals that are in supervisory roles. I had a bit of a heartbreaking conversation with a younger educator who wanted to intentionally promote a program they were doing and connect it back with Pride Week. And their county director said, absolutely not. You will not do that. And so this struggle of, I want to do better, but yet I have folks that are in opposition to it. So a lot to unpack with that without question. Earlier, Nia's comment was without fear of retribution. And I'll actually take that a little bit of a different perspective. I think it's actually wise to be mindful, is how I will phrase that. I think it's wise for you to prepare for the potential of opposition, because that means you've thought it through. Who have I readied as far as this intentionality that I'm going to take for our, you can see that I'm hearing that as well. So they're working on that, so all right. But what I'm drawing attention to is, depending on wherever you work, as we want to do this intentional work that's not our legacy approach and so forth, we kind of need to do our homework. And so my thought is, you need to not just speak about it as a broader office unit, however that happens to look, but come together. What are our collective goals as it relates to diversity and inclusion and intentionality of programs and so forth? What will each of us bring to the table? So you're all together on the direction that we're going. Further, drawing on the historic extension program development model of having extension advisory committees, there's an opportunity for us to be very transparent about that pursuit and our intent, and get their buy-in collectively, so that then we don't run into the scenario where the chairperson of the advisory board swoops in after we've started some effort, and then there was some big surprise. Then further, it's not, I don't know, I would never want to frame it where we have to run down to the county judge's office every time we want to do something that may be controversial. Less so that, but more so, we're framing this as we want to reach all constituents in this county or in this community. We want to make certain all people feel well. How can they argue against that? I mean, that's something that's just paramount to living in a particular community. So be deliberate about sharing those broader goals, and then kind of fine-tune it into, here's our deliberate and intentional plan for this coming year, so they're not caught off guard as well. I mentioned earlier, about what can we hang our hat on, or to expand on that a bit. There is no question in my mind, as you do this work, especially the experience is what I often bring to the table, is kind of the LGBTQ lens and so forth. There's potential resistance with that. So you have to have policies in place. And so don't do that on the fly. That's the how do we prepare, how do we ready, and so forth, without fear of retribution. You have to have a policy, and don't do that on the fly. So my point is, if you're having a camp, if you work in 4-H youth development, and you happen to have a trans child that's coming to your camp, don't make a decision about that. Then you hopefully have started those thoughts earlier. And there are guiding principle documents that are available at the national level to help any state to secure that, and especially through our Title IX office at many of our universities and so forth. So as you have resistance come to you, whatever that happens to look like, whether it's people who, they don't like the color of the other people that are coming, they don't like the gender of the other people that are coming, they don't like the sexuality of it, whatever it happens to be, that you have this policy that you can stand behind. It's not easy though, folks, for you to stand, especially often in our very rural communities, and to have to try to not only educate, but then also help them to understand why that's creating a richer program for all of us. It's not easy. So I wouldn't go in naively.
Roland here, but a couple things that resonated from Jeff's comments is that if we're not doing this work in a meaningful way without resistance, we're missing the mark, right? Because we would just be maintaining the status quo. So some disruption, some upset feelings, some discomfort is supposed to happen. It's not easy. I often am the only person of color, Black woman in particular, in the space, and in administration, even fewer of me. And I had my share of hate mail over the last 2 years in this role. I've had my share of being called a racist, and then I'm tearing down the traditions of the 4-H program, complaints to my administrators, all of these things that are hurtful, that take a toll on our mental state. Let's try this again. Is this working now? Take a toll on our mental state. And I've often questioned, am I in a space where I feel valued? And I'm an administrator, right? So I have to think about how our youth and our adults feel who are coming by choice to our program and might easily decide to leave because of we're not in the right place that we need to be as an organization. So we have to deal with that discomfort. We have to deal with that pushback. Finding allies, and if you don't have many within your state, find them in your neighboring states. That's the blessing of Extension, is that we have them everywhere. Extension system. So find states that are doing this well and that have shown success in diversifying their volunteer base, because we can use that as an example. The way we might sell this work to a community member might be different to the dean of the college, right? We want to show the value of why it's important, why it's relevant that we have diversity among our volunteer base. And being thankful that right now NIFA is on board with this story, right? So take advantage of the fact that NIFA is saying this is a requirement of our system. We are following our federal guidelines. We are following our statements that we put in our documents. And we're following the funds that are saying that this work is valuable. Oftentimes we are afraid to lose some of our volunteers or partners who've been so dedicated to our programs and may have served a constituency that has been around Extension for a while. We have to ask ourselves, are we prepared to say goodbye to folks who don't align with our philosophy of inclusion? And ask yourself that, are we prepared to say goodbye to volunteers, partners, and money that don't align with our philosophy of inclusion? And I guarantee you, there are dollars, there are people, and there are partners waiting if they do say goodbye. We have to be ready to get them on board because they may not feel like we're ready for them yet. So thank you, Jeff, for your comment. The next question is for Xiomara. What is the most difficult part of implementing diversity and inclusion in Extension work? And then we've heard some solutions. Can you offer some others as to where do we start or how do we continue with this important work?
Definitely. Oh, can you hear me? Yes? Okay, great. Challenges. But in this case, the question was addressed in terms of like the most challenging part. And I will focus on that, the most challenging part, because we have now, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay, I will focus on like the most challenging part of implementing diversity and inclusion in Extension volunteer work. And I have to be very honest with you, and I'm using my educator mindset. Finding your why. If you don't have a purpose for making that change, nothing will happen. I learned Extension since I was a kid, and I knew that I was a programmer. And every time I move from one state to another, I have to start over again and delivered. And I was successful, and I feel successful, but my why was not defined. I was learning as I was like stepping in, like one, like covering or passing one step to the other, reassuring that I was good enough to serve the people that didn't look like me and bringing that value to the organization. But it was not until my last 5-6 years when I found my why. And I have to undo what I had learned and the purpose. I'm a product of Extension. But undoing that, it's very hard. And if we continue taking that message to new generation of professionals, we are confusing them because they have seen the reality of the potential and the work that we should be doing. When I said finding that why and changing the mindset, having a programmatic center mindset instead of a people mindset center mindset, because the programs will continue there and will be relevant. But who is the recipient? Who are the ones that can help us expand? this is a people business, which means that the content will continue there. We have plenty experts that will be continue doing research, finding the best tools for innovation, and also to help our society and our communities to get the knowledge, the innovation, that technology, but we are the experts of working with people. That's not what academia does, which means that we have to embrace that. When I just understood that in order for me to move forward and continue open doors and bringing access and see that value reflect in our programs, that I have just to say a little bit of like maybe step out and say goodbye for things that were not helping invest in new talent, because I was adding more value to the existing cadre of like people I was serving, but I was not sharing those to the others that really need and have the opportunity to continue growing in those spaces. And that's the thing, like we all have mechanism in place that provides us a clear vision of who is represented in our extension volunteer groups and who is missing. Let's just use that data. Use that data, and that will help you out. And we talk about demographics. Demographics are not only based on race and ethnicity. We have like other elements that we need to consider, social conditions that can help shape that list of needs. But all will depend on your program goals. If your program goals are not people-centered, I don't think we have a purpose. And those are the things that that should be driving us to decide what we should bring to that menu of extension programming. What solutions that I suggest to work through these challenges? Identify and remove barriers that can just take people away from that opportunity of volunteering. And also your diverse volunteers can also act as role models and can bring people that have similar identities, and our programs will continue growing. Identify time to meet your volunteers on a personal level. Relationship is the key. It's not about saying that you collaborate and someone came and helped you out with a program. You have to invest in working with those relationships. Evaluate your volunteer recruitment process. I have a personal story. When I moved, even I thought I knew extension when I moved to the United States, and that even I was not a 4-H educator, it was a cultural shock to me. I was a 4-H'er, and I grew up seeing people delivering 4-H programs in other places. But when I got to Marin County, Florida, it was shocking. I remember after like my first training at the university, like on my way back home, calling my brother and saying, I don't think I can do that. This is too much, because it's hard for me to adjust. Like I come with a ag and judging teams background, and then we were working on all the positive youth development components that I value and is relevant, but I came from a different culture, which means that I have to work in that adaptation to make myself like a resource for the community I was hired to serve. And I made it, but it was super scary, which means that in this case, when I visit the extension office for the first time, and I interview with the extension educator, the only option I received, being new to the community, was to volunteer as a club leader. I didn't have relationships. I didn't have like a community I can just go out and reach out and start a 4-H program. Even I was part of 4-H, I was not able to deliver the same way that we do in our regular programs, which means that scared me to death. Because I said, but I want to collaborate, but they are not giving me options that can just match with my expertise or my talents or my experiences, which means that I have to step out and just volunteer in another setting, the school system. And that was my first experience as a volunteer in the United States, because I have a teacher who needed my skill set to help support her students. And she was able to listen to what I wanted to do and the experience I want to gain being new in the community, and they provide that space for me to be useful. After I learned about the community and the culture, I was brave enough to apply for a position in extension and also expose myself to learn about the culture of that specific community. For that reason, evaluate your volunteer recruitment process and also strategize for team lead experiences. Sometimes we have these approaches of like putting our new volunteers in a spot, like giving them like individual assignments when we just have to promote more the collaboration. It has been proved that people learn better in teams, which means that having that kind of mindset will help. Be open to think out of the box. Yes, we have like manuals, we have handouts that tells you like how you should be doing it. Like those are not maybe policies, just bring new ideas and just make sure that you are making those decisions for the benefit of your program, and also that will just be impactful to the outcome you want to get. Sometimes it's not a transaction. It has to be followed through. Offer training sessions for new volunteers. That's another thing I had learned in this career. We often have the tendency, because the programs already have a calendar that happen throughout the year, because we are very good in planning, and those calendars are spectacular because everything should be like done the way that has been done. But the thing is that just be very mindful in terms of like volunteers. New volunteers have different needs. Diverse group of volunteers have a specific needs. Just cultivate and work with those that are starting in that journey separately until they are ready. You equip them with memories, with experiences before you bring them to the general group, because that will help to release that sense of like not feeling empowered and comfortable, or the belonging piece. You bring your volunteers and start like merging with the integration when you already invest and equip in those that are not at the same in the same space. Create affordable, accessible, and safe programs, and provide various ways for the new volunteers to contribute. That's the thing, making them feel valued. After you had been sensitive in identifying what skill set they can bring for the purpose of that program that you already identified, it's very important. Create a recognition system for new volunteers. When you invite new volunteers to come to events that had been set up for like the groups that you already have established, if you don't have things that give them purpose to be there and that they have chances to be acknowledged, that will be another barrier. And something I want to say before, two things I want to say quickly before I finish my answer. Identify and train a group of experienced volunteers, the ones that you already have, that can mentor new volunteers. And also identify a funding source that can help provide stipend for middle management volunteers. Because the life of our volunteers had changed. We used to have like many volunteers that dedicate hundreds of hours to our programs. That's not the same anymore. If you are growing your programs in after school time, you might need to find ways to compensate and help support your volunteers. It cannot be for free anymore, which means that that's part of the planning. And I'm advising you to think about it, because that's what had been supporting the new programs that I had been establishing in our state. The funding, it's very important. Volunteer not necessarily is a free, no-cost service.
Thank you so much, Xiomara, for your experience there. So as we talk through our next steps when we go back to our communities, there'll be some bumps along the way. This work takes a sense of humility, right? Because you might ask questions that are uncomfortable or can come off offensive. You might lift up an example of or practice some sense of tokenism. And what that means is you have perhaps one African-American volunteer as an example, and their pictures everywhere to show that your organization is finally diverse, right? Or you might ask that one person who represents a different cultural group to serve in every committee to compensate that voice is always heard. So you might have some tokenism. You might have microaggressions that exist within the workspace or the volunteer space. and other unintentional consequences of getting into this work that's not easy. So Annie, can you talk a little bit about some of those examples that we might experience and then some strategies and how we might be mindful of that and combat that?
Thank you. Thanks for being the AV person too, but I don't think it's working, is it? Oh, it is. Okay, great, wonderful. I want to focus a little bit on microaggressions. And this kind of really builds off of Xiomara's story and experiences, and the experiences that I think the whole panel has shared about aggressions and microaggressions. So we've told stories about outright aggressions. Microaggressions are those kind of little subtle ouch kinds of feelings. And just by show of hands, how many of you have experienced microaggressions in your own family? Okay. How about in working with Extension? How many of you have experienced microaggressions? A lot of people here. Almost more people raising their hand for their experience in Extension than experience in your own family. I've certainly experienced microaggressions on the job, and I think that the microaggressions were the worst when I was an administrator, because I think that once we start working outside of people's assumptions, stereotypes, and boundaries that they've set for us, people will tend to unknowingly often kind of say something, do something, lash out a little bit. How many of you can call to mind that time, that feeling when, wow, it really kind of hurt you? Okay, so I'm just going to ask everybody to keep that in their mind and save it for later use, because I think that when we experience microaggressions, when we experience them, we can certainly identify that, pinpoint it, and feel it. When we unknowingly sometimes, or sometimes covertly or overtly, inflict a microaggression on someone else, it can be a little hard to recognize. And I think that we have an Extension way of doing things, a 4-H way of doing things. How many of you have heard the phrase Extension bones? How about bleeding green? And just be mindful of how those phrases may come across to people who haven't had experience or who have had plenty of experience, like Xiomara, with 4-H and with Extension. I didn't have experience with Extension. I didn't know what Extension was when I applied for the job. Maybe the only person in the world who applied for a job without knowing what the organization was. I had heard of 4-H, though. And if people had kind of followed that Extension bones kind of logic, I wouldn't be here talking with all of you today. I don't think I would have been hired. So you have to think outside of the boundaries, the conditions, the stereotypes, check our assumptions at the door. And so when you see yourself like in an interaction with a volunteer or with a group of volunteers that maybe you've depended on in the past and they're no longer showing up, investigate. You can tell from a look on somebody's face when, oh, well, maybe I hurt their feelings or maybe I said something that I shouldn't have said. How many of you like to avoid conflict? All right. I am going to ask you to be brave and to be kindly frank. A lot of people think that being straightforward is unkind. I don't think it is. I think it's possible to be straightforward and kind, to have a frank conversation and be kind. To say to someone, I noticed you haven't been coming around or volunteering anymore. Can I just ask why that is? To expose your own vulnerabilities and to ask the questions. I think I may have just hurt your feelings, and that's the last thing that I want to do. Can you help me understand? Because I want to do better. that is both straightforward and kind. It's helping to investigate what's going on here, especially if you notice a group of people who may have volunteered in the past and are no longer volunteering. There's something going on there. They didn't have a good experience. So why is that? And just have that open conversation with them. To have a trusting enough of a relationship to be able to do that. There are strategies for restoring and rebuilding trust. One of my favorites for having a conversation, it could be in your own family, it could be with someone that you work with, it could be a group of people who you're hoping to form a new relationship with, and that is to tell the story of how we form our worldview. Social scientists say that we form our worldview in 3 ways. What was going on in the world at the time that we were born, what was going on in the world at the time we came of age, so when we got our first car, our first job, when we graduated from high school, when we went off to school, and how our first great tragedies or joys impacted us. And so you can think about somebody right now where maybe you need to have a deeper conversation with them and say, I saw Annie Jones at this conference and she talked about social scientists and, you know, I was thinking about that. Can you tell me the story of how, what was going on at the time that you were born? And I'll tell you mine. Or how our worldview was formed. And by doing so, you form a deeper understanding of where people are coming from, and you have the opportunity to also share where you're coming from. Just be careful about listening, because so often we listen and we think about things where we want to provide a rebuttal or how I think about it differently or what we have in common. Just truly listen and repeat back to them. Wow, that must have been really difficult when your father died. And use that as a means to have a conversation. But by all means, have the conversation. Don't let things just slip and go away. Have enough respect for yourself and for the people that you're working with and volunteering to have a conversation, to be kindly frank. And by doing so, instead of building walls, you'll build relationships. You'll restore relationships.
Great, thank you so much. I like that phrase, being kindly frank. It requires a lot of us to be bold enough to do that, and I appreciate that. And you gave some great examples of questions that you might ask folks to build relationship, because that we've heard many times how important that is. And then I also challenge us to ask questions of those who are not in agreement with some of our decisions as an organization, and just flat out ask, well, who do you think should be excluded from this program? Right? Put the responsibility on those who may not be happy about some of our policy changes or our philosophy statements or guiding principles. Who would you like to see excluded from this program? And if that answer doesn't align with who we serve in Extension, it may not be the best fit for them to be a volunteer in our program. But asking those questions, and back to what Jeff and Annie said, taking time to discuss the benefits of us being a more diverse and inclusive community, right? Organization, having more voices heard at the table and reflected in our program is beneficial to our program. It's a requirement of us all, and philosophically it's what we believe. So having more of those questions to talk about the value of that is important. Let me just pause really quick to see if there's any live question, and if you don't want to walk up to the mic, just raise your hand and we can try to get it that way. Yes. Okay.
Okay, first, great job. You all have done a wonderful job, and I love the word intentional and sensitivity, DMR. That's beautiful. So a group of youth that, I wrote this down early on because I wanted to pay attention to you, but a group of youth that I haven't heard a conversation about is our youth coming from foster care, and also whom are adopted either through the foster care system or otherwise. So they also don't think they look like anyone when they walk in a room. But that's not something you can say, right? So that's private for those children oftentimes, or maybe they're just not ready to share yet. So I would love to hear your thoughts regarding policies, procedures, how we can be flexible deadlines, those sorts of things. And I really, and we talk about that among many cultures, and we're so rigid sometimes with our rules. And I was a 4-H agent. I've been a professional for about 17 years now. So this is something we talk about with our staff, but I would just love to hear perspective on that.
Great question. And before I see if there's a panelist who wants to give some response, one resource that I'll share is Access, Equity, and Belonging Committee does have a champion group focused on foster care youth. This focuses on youth audiences, but lots of the work that's there can relate to volunteers or adults that might work in that space as well. So there are some fact sheets, there's research, there's literature on the Access, Equity, and Belonging page. And the two champion chairs of that group, as well as the members, can certainly provide more specific responses to some examples. But it is true that we need to think about our barriers that we impose ourselves through our policies. And we sometimes forget that because most of our policies are there for a reason, for the protection of our program or for our families or for our reputation and so forth. But sometimes they might be so restrictive that they are excluding a group unknowingly. So taking time to critically reflect on what those might be, my rule of thumb always is ask. Ask the question, which of these policies are not allowing you to engage? Or which of these make you feel uncomfortable when you come to the space? Because we won't know the answer if we're not from that group all the time, right? So trying to learn more from that audience is something that I would encourage. Is there another panelist that wants to briefly give a response before we close?
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I have the personal experience to work with foster care organizations and in Indianapolis, and it was a long-lasting relation, at least for the 3 years that I served there. But the barriers with the systems are very, very high. And in terms of like the potential is endless as long as we have the conversation with the right people. And I have to say, based on my personal opinion, it has been handled as an extra work. It's not like, it has not been addressed like as a priority. And a lot of the work I do is for access to higher education. And I have to say that if we are seeking for an opportunity to really serve vulnerable groups, that's the way to go. Because the foster care system has things in play that can benefit us to achieve that goal and help support the students. The thing is that we are so mindset in the situation of like the 4-H culture, the way that we know and we want to do it, that we are like hiding like the opportunities of serving these youth. Something that it's relevant to say is that we cannot reveal identity in terms of like all the questions that 4-H asks for somebody to be part of the organization, including like their enrollment process. Even if we enroll them, I have to come with fake names. But then at the time that these students like go out and have a foster family, it will be up to the family if they want to continue being involved in the 4-H program. But for the time that these students are in the system, in collaboration and partnership, these departments help us to deliver the program. But as I said, it's like an extra effort because our program has not been designed to provide that long-lasting 4-H experience to these students. But that's something that I have to say that if we make it a purpose, we can find ways to navigate and also have a strong goal in serving foster youth in our organization.
Thank you so much, Simara. So we have a few minutes left before we break for lunch, and we're going to close with a call to action. So we want you to leave this conference not with just new ideas or excitement, but what will you take home and actually implement back when you get to your extension program. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to close really briefly with just a couple of sentences on a call to action on what you can go home and think about and do differently or more of. So Jeff, do you want to start us off?
I'm happy to. There's a few thoughts that come to mind. Call to action would be to reiterate a point that I made earlier about intentionally planning. So when you get home, to make time to sit down and really, really assess your program, whatever program you bring to the table on behalf of Extension. And as such, where are we lacking or missing particular groups or folks or people from our community and so forth? And with those voids, your call to action is, what can I intentionally do to ready myself to engage them? And we have to educate ourselves And I know sometimes that's scary, but you can ask questions of people and frame it like that. Help me to know, as Annie was saying, help me to better understand. I want to do better, but I'm not sure. You can openly ask questions in that fashion, and they know you really care. You really care about us, and you really want us there. And they will help you to know how to design and build those programs and so forth with that genuine approach that you may have. Light example that I'll wrap up with, often when I worked in 4-H youth development directly, and we would do outreach related programs, and my faculty would tell me, I want to do it, I don't know what to do, and I think I'm going to say the wrong thing and step on someone's toes. And we might focus on the Hispanic community, and they say, well, they don't come because they just want to play soccer. And so my pause was, well, then go meet the soccer people. Do a nutrition program, do a physics program on how to make the ball go directly. Do sports nutrition. I mean, join the soccer people if that's where that community is. Go meet them and understand how you can engage with them and so forth. Our Master Gardener programs, if I've had conversations with people, one of the ways that they've provided an entree into new communities is cultural cooking classes. They'll have an intentional program on cultural gardens and things like that, and then they'll have someone from that community come in and do a cooking class. And it's just a phenomenal way for them to volunteer and demonstrate and prove value and so forth, but for others to learn. I worked in a community years ago where there was a very large Laotian community because we were on the Gulf. And so, folks came in. I didn't know a whole lot about them, but I had to learn. And so, just be intentional as you build that.
Thank you. I would like to encourage everybody to be Jedi warriors. Doesn't that sound cool? We talk a lot about diversity, inclusion, and equity. Justice. Yes. Justice is really important, I think, to restore, to actively and intentionally restore times when people have been excluded, where systems and policies and structures have actively worked to exclude and exterminate people around this table, historically exclude us and exterminate us. So seek out justice. Seek out ways to get people involved. Ziamara talked about honorariums and paying people. Let's get people involved and respect their time and what they're giving us, the input that they're providing us. Let's use indigenous methodologies. It is so brave to walk in two worlds of our own indigenous ways of knowing and university Eurocentric kinds of ways of being and doing. It's brave and it's so important. We can learn more from our audiences than we can ever teach them. We all know that. And so open your hearts and your minds to doing that. Be a Jedi warrior.
For those who missed the acronym, it's Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, JEDI. All right, Maurice.
Testing. Everyone can hear me? Okay. So I have a few points to leave you with. I would explore the 5 languages of appreciation. I think you all should Google that, take a look at it. Those are words of affirmation, acts of service, gifts, quality, time, and even pats on the back. Some of those things will go a long way. Listening to learn and understand. Be mindful of your body language. I would also say what you say out your mouth. Have a friend to check you, and this goes to everybody. And that includes going into think about that, how you could be perceived if you wanting to recruit a volunteer. How they may view you based on your body language or what you say out your mouth. Or coming to a table at a lunch and everybody's looking at that particular person like they're weirded out. Those things make a difference if somebody wants to participate or get to be a volunteer in an extension program. I would also add collaborations and partnerships, parent involvement, and addressing the challenges centered around youth, trust, and cultural barriers make a difference. Remember, coming together is a beginning. Keeping together is progress. Working together is success. The first session that we had, the guest speaker said, fly. First, lead yourself. So I encourage everyone in here to really look deep inside yourself. How are you perceived with others? What does your body language look like? How can I be better to better the system to recruit diverse volunteers? And I would also note in my last few moments, I work for USDA NEFA. We have a new AFRI Education Workforce Development grant that's posted. The DEIA component is a focal point of one of the grant program priority areas. So I encourage you all to look at that and apply. Thank you.
Okay, and what I would like you to take with you today, I love the word of being adaptable and flexibility. Adaptable because you never know like what the needs and the changes that will going to be out there when you are working on your programs. I know change, it's scary. People don't like to change. The thing is that many people has been resistant to change. And we have to learn how to embrace change, seeing the opportunity of become better in our organization, but also in ourselves. The secret of change is to focus all our energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new. But that's halfway true, because we have to look back to what has not been done correctly or things that has not worked for us and for the society and the organization in order to plan the new. That's where we can get that purpose. And also, we appreciate legacy. We appreciate history, but the history has to be told correctly. And we are responsible to look for those facts and undo the things that had not been taught correctly, and just gain that knowledge to be able to fix those things that need to be in order for us to progress. We have plenty of opportunities out there, especially in what we talk about, like potential partners that are waiting for us to take the lead, work on those changes, and join us to support the programs that will be addressing the challenges of diversity and inclusion in our organization.
Thank you so much to our panelists. And I will leave you with the things that we started with. Be bold. Some disruption to the status quo is needed, and we must work towards robust equity. So thank you all for your time. I encourage you to chat with our panelists over lunch, and I will turn it back over to our host. Thank you all. Thanks to our panelists.